Enigma depravatio est. Enigma crudelitas est.
Welcome back, my fellow seekers, to Atlantis in Egypt Part 2. In Part 1 I showed the Islamic perspective on Atlantis that points to a more realistic outlook on the legend. However, many of you take Plato's reference of the Pillars of Hercules too strongly, even James Cameron. So let's address that issue.
While the search continues off the coast of southern Spain, I'm nearing Sicily. Freund is right. Plato places Atlantis west of the Pillars of Hercules, and most scholars are convinced that he's talking about the Strait of Gibraltar. But some historians believe that Plato is referring to the Strait of Messina between the Italian peninsula and the island of Sicily.
We're sailing right through the Strait of Messina right now. Sunrise, it's gorgeous. And you can really see how close the two land masses really are. Italy's right over there, and right across, there's Sicily. So it's entirely conceivable that at one point these were regarded as the Pillars of Hercules. There might have been physically some pillars put up as you sailed out into the Mediterranean. So I can totally imagine that as seafaring got better and they pushed out, the Pillars of Hercules moved from here, their original position, to Gibraltar, facing the Atlantic.
So if the Strait of Messina is the original Pillars of Hercules, can it be that Sardinia, on the other side of the strait, was once Atlantis?
Now, many will say that Plato clearly said it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, but according to researcher George Sarantitis of the Plato Project, you will learn that place names change as new lands are discovered by different cultures. For example, he states, who truly knew where the Pillars of Hercules were? It was mainly the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the Romans. The Romans never knew for sure where the location of the pillars were. They believed they should probably be in the area of the island of Cadiz, off of Liberia. Since then, the rest of the world follows suit in this assumption. But there's no iota of historical evidence that the Pillars of Hercules were located, one at Gibraltar and the other across the Strait of Africa, or that they were both in Spain, at Cadiz, or anywhere else, as has been continued to be dogmatically presumed. The Phoenicians tried and failed to locate them and proceeded to arbitrarily name the area of Cadiz as the site of the Pillars of Hercules. On the other hand, the Carthaginians are known to have been aware of the exact location, but for their own reasons did not spread the word to others at the time. He goes on to say, it may seem hard to believe, but there's actually plenty of written testimonies from credible ancient Greek historical sources that go against any pre-proposed location. Once again, the accurate retranslation of previously misrendered texts by Plato, Aristotle, and many others show that historically the Pillars of Hercules were located inside the Gulf of Gabes, with both pillars being geographically in Africa, not in Europe. The pillars were not actually man-made stelas or columns, but natural geoformations depicting pillars, such as characteristics of tall hills or mountains. Only Alphorus has made a report on his visiting of the pillars and the associated Temple of Hercules there. The Temple of Hercules on the island of Cadiz was built much later by the Phoenicians, in the place where they presumed the temple would have been made. It was mostly Strabo who reports on all these relative stories, but there are also quite a few other ancient references to locations of Pillars of Hercules. He goes on to say that Plato gives positions of the Pillars of Hercules in juxtaposition to the Atlantic Pelagos. The term Pelagos is the Greek designation for the body of marine water with certain defined properties, or characteristics of types of seas. Translators have arbitrarily consistently rendered the word Pelagos as ocean. In fact, even though well understood by Plato as simply a concept of threshold, he nowhere mentions the word ocean in his text. If he meant ocean, he would have used the Greek word for ocean. By mistranslating understanding the word Pelagos as ocean, Area 1 is defined as being where Atlanteans lived and where from the inside they emerged to the outside. Thus, Area 2 is the territories of the Athenians and Egyptians and Liberians. Apart from this mistake, many translators were found to contain several other significant inconsistencies which have been detected. So basically what he's saying is that it's really about a threshold space, mainly between islands. Now, in the perspective of Solon, not Plato, because Solon was a lot earlier than Plato, he would have said beyond the gates of Hercules in his perspective at the time. And that was in the Athenian world order. And that was mainly the archipelago region of the Aegean Sea. These island chains around Crete is the juxtaposition or the threshold space between the Aegean Sea, specifically as he mentioned it references a sea, to the actual Atlantic. So the Atlantic at the time was actually the Mediterranean. People forget that. You got to put things in perspective of the ancients. So to Solon and Plato, beyond the gates of Hercules is beyond the realm of the Athenian world order, beyond these islands around Crete. These are the threshold spaces that once you leave this, it gets more and more mysterious to the Athenians. And it even, as they explored more, they start to associate the Pillars of Hercules based on what the Phoenicians start to discover around Tunisia. So they would place the Pillars of Hercules as certain temple complexes or port areas. They would place a Hercules kind of monument there, or around a juxtaposition, a threshold space of Sicily and Italy. This is a very narrow area. This would also been considered a Pillars of Hercules. It's basically the Greeks as they expand, or the Phoenicians as they expand, they're just moving it farther and farther west, until basically the Roman world order, in the perspective of the Romans, they would say logically it makes sense to now name this region near the Strait of Gibraltar as the Pillar of Hercules, and rightfully so. But we're going back really far in history, not the perspective of the Romans and not the perspective of Plato really, but the perspective of Solon. Beyond the gates of Hercules, all the gates they would refer to, or the entrances out of their world order, was beyond these islands around Crete. Also around Constantinople, near Istanbul. So into the Black Sea, you could say that is also beyond the gates of Hercules. So any references of Hercules has always been around the Aegean Sea. Not way over here. Most Greeks never explored this. Only the Phoenicians, which are a derivative culture of the Egyptians. So yeah, they were basically saying Egypt, but for some reason they didn't want to give credit to Egypt for whatever geopolitical reason. They didn't want to say Egypt was Atlantis as the city-state. Or there's a misunderstanding between Solon and the priest of Sais, where the priest of Sais is mentioning about a land beyond the gates of Hercules at the time that they also knew, as a reference to Gibraltar, was North America. The Egyptians may have somehow known that there was a lost large continent, but that's a separate story that was put together later by Plato. There are two stories, one of the lost continent and one of the lost city-state. So the Egyptians may have known somehow, by probably Viking explorers that came back and forth down to Egypt into France, and got all the way to North America and then back, maybe just a few explorers. But it really is in the perspective of Solon, where Solon's saying beyond these islands of the Aegean Sea is Atlantis. Except at the time, the Egyptians also lost their history. So there's some misunderstanding between the priest of Sais and Solon himself. Because even the Egyptians are like, well, I'm not sure. We have a legend about a lost island city-state, but we also have a legend of lost large landmass way beyond the gates of the Gibraltar. So It really is kind of a misunderstanding and mistranslations, but also just a misunderstanding of the perspective of the people at the time. It's really referring beyond the Aegean region, and that is where you will find Atlantis.
The mapping of unexplored areas was a science that had been aspired to throughout history. Knowing an unexplored area and displaying it on a map offered a great advantage over other kingdoms, something that was considered a challenge at all levels in ancient times. But with some of the oldest maps still in existence, we don't even know their origin. People have speculated a lot about the age of the Giza pyramids. For many researchers, the three most important pyramids in Egypt are thousands of years older than the official estimates, which date them to 2500 BC. Evidence for an older dating can be found in the Nubian Museum of Aswan. There's an ostrich egg in the exhibition, which could be a 1,000-year-old map. At that time, cartographic representations on animal skins were very common. You would even find them on wood or stone, as these were durable and common materials. But the drawing of a map on the shell of an ostrich egg was very unusual for that time. The egg was discovered in 1907 by the British archaeologist Cecil Mallaby Firth in the Nubian region of southern Egypt. In the tomb number 96, he discovered the remains of an unknown man. Among the objects enclosed with the deceased was the controversial ostrich egg, decorated with strange drawings. On the egg, you can see 3 triangles, and on the right a picture with crossed lines. This led to the thesis that this egg could be a map showing the location of the pyramids of Giza. The journalist J.J. Benitez was mainly responsible for this publication. The 3 triangles with horizontal lines represented the pyramids of Cheops, Khephren, and Mycenoros, and their exact position west of the Nile is shown by this elongated and crossed picture. This supposed map would not have attracted attention if the funeral had taken place after the pyramids had been built. But the Tomb of Nubia was dated to 4000 BC. That's 1,500 years before the official construction of the pyramids. This would mean that the pyramids are even older than the ostrich egg itself, which would contradict the established theory. On the other hand, official Egyptology rejects the theory of the Egyptian egg map and claims that it is a simple representation of a landscape typical of the First Nagata period, a pre-dynastic Egyptian culture attributed to the art of this egg. Are we standing here in front of a picture of simple mountains, or in front of one of the oldest historical evidence of the pyramids of Giza, which was drawn more than 6,000 years ago?
Now, as a designer, I clearly see 3 hatch patterns that are denoting a particular space. But what's really interesting is a depiction of 2 different generic scales on each side of the egg globe. On one side, we see a scaled out depiction of what could be the Nile River, for the hieroglyph for a river is a jagged line. To the right could indicate the Red Sea, and to the far left hatch pattern could indicate the Atlantic, with the bend showcasing a general shape of North Africa. To the person who carved this was their known world. The pyramids are situated to the left of the pictogram outside the Nile Valley in the desert, indicating with no hatch marks, using the negative space. It is situated below the circular design, which could be denoting the Nile Delta region. Instead of connecting the river and the delta design, they kept it in a pictographic hatch pattern layout, almost like a cartouche with 5 characters. The circular design could be the delta, but also a city within the delta, which could be Atlantis, denoted by the hole in the egg used to drain out the egg, but also used as a symbol to represent a city within the delta, as Jimmy from Bright Insight points out. To the Egyptians, the circle indicates a walled city, but then this would contradict Jimmy's hypothesis of Atlantis being at the Rikat structure, which is ridiculous. Even Robert Schoch, a geologist, is going to have trouble swallowing that pill. So I hope Jimmy takes this egg as evidence to show that maybe Atlantis is situated in the delta. So this would tell us that Atlantis is north of the pyramids, and this would be near Heliopolis. Not all the way in the delta, but at the front end of the Garden of Eden. Now if we take a look at the other side of the egg, we see a scaled out version of the region, a bulge that sticks out. This hatch space indicates not just the river, but the green space. And that bulge could indicate the Fayum Oasis, as Jimmy points out, which is south of Giza, and Giza is south of the circle, symbolized as the delta and the city. What's interesting is there's also a scratch hatch pattern on the far end of the bulge. Besides the clearly denoted pyramids, this to me indicates the Karun Lake. So this extra detail really enforces to me that this is clearly a map of the Nile region in a simplistic pictographic hatch pattern. We have to keep in mind the clues that Plato gives us with a more rational approach, such as the Athenians, or if not the Athenians, the Minoans, who the Athenians derived from, warred with the Atlanteans. So this really puts Atlantis in the Mediterranean context, or the Atlantic of its time. Also, Plato tells us that this was a civilization with 7 kingdoms. Atlantis was the capital location at the head of the one-winged serpent, that being the Nile River Valley Island Oasis. Egypt was a confederation of kingdoms vying for the golden throne to unify what we could call Kumandra, aka Agartha. And the dating of this has some serious implications for not just Egyptologists, but for the independent researchers like Jimmy pushing the younger Dryas dating on Atlantis. Because there's a very important artifact that was rediscovered, for which YouTuber Ancient Architects will explain.
So, why is this so important? Well, this has to be a relic from the time the Great Pyramid was built, or at the very least enlarged, because the Queen's Chamber air shaft was sealed on the inside by the load-bearing wall blocks of the Queen's Chamber, and also sealed at the other end, deep inside the core of the Great Pyramid by this limestone door. Ever since this door was added, nothing and nobody has been inside this shaft until Dixon discovered it in 1872. I believe the dolerite ball could have been used in a method employed by the pyramid builders to check that the shafts were straight, and that none of the masonry joints had slipped. Drop the ball at the end of the shaft, and if it reached the other end, the shaft was a successful construction. The hook and wood I don't know, but because they were found inside a shaft that hasn't been opened since the pyramid was built, that means they are original. With this incredible rediscovery and radiocarbon dating, this really is incredible news. It is older than the experts imagined, and for me, this means one of 3 things. A. It means the Great Pyramid actually dates back to 3341 to 3094 BC, sometime at the beginning of dynastic history. Option B. As I said in my last video on the Great Pyramid, I believe the pyramid was built and also enlarged during the reign of Khufu. This find could imply that Khufu did actually just enlarge it, and it was an earlier structure that predates him. Option C, and the date could simply be the age of the wood, maybe from the centre of a long-lived tree. At this stage, in all honesty, each of the 3 options is possible, and it is just one piece of evidence to add to the mix. And annoyingly for many alternative researchers, the radiocarbon dating of this piece of wood does not discount Khufu being the builder of the Great Pyramid. In the times of ancient Egypt, wood was scarce, and so it would have been treasured and recycled for many years. So we can't discount that the wood was used by Pharaoh Khufu's labourers, but we also can't discount that it does date back to an earlier time. Either way, this find should hopefully stop the ideas that the Great Pyramid is 10, 20 or 30,000 years old, as some people have suspected, and now we can finally get closer to the truth.
And I agree with Matt, the pyramids did not exist during the time of Atlantis. Instead, they may be memorializing the time period as pointed out by Robert Bauval with the alignment of Orion as a master plan. But I would argue against the wood coming from the center of a large cedar tree which is averaging about 1,000 years. People tend to create tools from the least amount of effort, so it's far more likely that this is part of a pole that was carved from the branch of an old cedar tree to retain some of its moisture, giving it flexibility to put into the shaft. So most likely the diameter was no larger than 6 inches, making that part of the tree no older than 100 years. The diameter of the pole may have been about 4 inches. So the dating would still be about 3100 BC, and this pole may have been used during the enlargement hypothesis of the pyramid under Khufu to refurbish the pyramid and enlarge it. But the main core of the pyramid could still be even older, up to at least 3341 BC. So we can't dismiss that the margin of errors may be quite large and that archaeologists may have to rethink the dating of these monuments, such as the camel relief monument, which YouTuber The Lost History Channel reports on.
The prehistoric camel carvings of Saudi Arabia are the oldest known reliefs of an animal that can be dated. As reported by researchers in Science Direct, the Archaeological Journal of Sciences. And the researchers report in their findings that the life-sized naturalistic reliefs of the camel site in northern Arabia have been severely damaged by erosion. This, coupled with substantial destruction of the surrounding archaeological landscape, has made a chronological assessment of the site very difficult. And to overcome these problems, the researchers have combined results from a wide range of methods, including an analysis of surviving tool marks, an assessment of weathering and erosion patterns, possible X-ray fluorescence spectrometry and luminescence dating of fallen fragments. In addition, test excavations identified a homogeneous lithnic assemblage and faunal remains that were sampled for radiocarbon dating. The researchers show that the reliefs were carved with stone tools and that the creation of the reliefs as well as the main period of activity at the site date to the Neolithic period, with Neolithic arrowheads and radiocarbon dates attesting occupation to between 5200 and 5600 BC. And this is consistent with measurements of the aerial density of manganese and iron in the rock varnish. The site was likely in use over a very long period of time, and the reliefs were likely reworked when erosion began to obscure detailed features, and by 1000 BC the erosion was advanced enough to cause the first panels to fall off, in a process that still continues until today. And this camel site is the home to the oldest surviving large-scale naturalistic animal reliefs in the whole world. The life-size structures each likely took many months to complete by experts of their time, and obviously required scaffolding structures to build at this height above the ground level. Given the technological limitations around tools for carving and reaching this rock, their existence and the remains today is mesmerising. And the study's lead author, Maria Guagnin, an archaeologist at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History, and she told the United Arab Emirates based outlet, The National, she says, "These reliefs are absolutely stunning, bearing in mind we see them now in a heavily eroded state with many panels falling off. The original site, however, must have been absolutely mind-blowing."
Now this site could be foreshadowing the dating of certain monuments being older than the original archaeological research, which only dates it to 2,000 years old. But after more research they have put it to an older date. This site is actually located at an ancient caravan trading route between Eden, aka Egypt, and Sumer, where traders would rest at this monument marking the halfway point between Egypt and Sumer. So there was a trading route going back to at least 4500 BC. This trading route may have been established by the Atlanteans in Egypt. Also, there are smaller carvings of horses, and this is very important for advanced civilization. This might indicate that they had horses at least 4500 BC, before the time period of the Yamnaya Aryans that came down into Mohenjo-Daro. I think Atlantis was most likely the first Bronze Age civilization. The lack of evidence for metal tool marks is probably because these were used at the early stages of the carving process. The relief was smoothed out with water and sand and diorite stones, wearing away the evidence of metal chiseling. Most likely a combination of different stone tools and metal bronze tools were used in the process of carving, but the erosion of windblown sand has made it very hard to see any chisel marks. This is an important monument because it also is a stopping ground for traders who may have been going back and forth from Sumer to Atlantis. The Atlanteans may have ordered the construction of this carving as a stopping point. Sumer itself may be an Atlantean colony or tributary kingdom. And there are some more evidence pointing to the pyramids being older, which Matt will explain again.
In 2013, a paper was published regarding scientific tests known as surface luminescence dating on the Pyramid of Menkaure. In a nutshell, this method of dating measures the light energy that is stored in stone. From this, we can get a date of when the stone was last worked. And the youngest date of this pyramid casing stone of 2500 BC does fit between 2575 and 2465 BC. The range often quoted for Menkaure's reign. So, is that it? Has science finally proved that Menkaure could have built the pyramid in the 4th dynasty? Well, in my opinion, no, because the age of the cut granite for the casing stone was 3450 BC plus or minus 950 years. In fact, the very oldest the pyramid could be is pre-dynastic at 4400 BC, which is nearly 2000 years before Menkaure. Furthermore, the position where the sample was taken was on the flattened area of casing stone on the eastern face of the pyramid. And why is this area flattened? Stein Vandenhoven believes there could be a concealed door at this location, as the only other flattened part of the casing stone is on the northern face around the entrance. But the eastern face of the pyramid butts up against Menkaure's mortuary temple, a limestone structure that was certainly created by the 4th dynasty king, and therefore maybe this part of the pyramid was flattened by Menkaure to allow for a close fitting to his mortuary temple. This seems logical and likely. Surface luminescence dating only dates when a stone was last worked. The date of 3450 BC plus or minus 950 years is therefore the date when this particular sample of granite casing was flattened. Was this flattening an original part of the process when the pyramid was complete, or was it done later when a newer structure was placed up against it? More work clearly needs to be done, and this is certainly a disappointing place to take a sample from to date the pyramid. It would have been far better to take a sample from the pillow-like unfinished granite casing stones, because then there would have been no question of whether or not these stones were reworked.
Now let's take the non-conservative approach to the dating and say that the pyramid is 4400 BC and the wood artifact is 3341 BC. The camel relief is 5200 BC, and the egg dates to around 4000 BC. That would indicate that the pyramid age started around 4000 BC. So then what is the date of Atlantis? Well, if Atlantis couldn't be completely destroyed by natural disasters, and legends say that after the flood, people came back to rebuild Atlantis, but maybe not to come to rebuild the city-state, but the humid period dynastic pyramid age, aka Neo-Atlantis period, from 4000 BC to the Exodus, possibly caused by the Thera eruption some 1600 BC, near the date of the legend of Sodom and Gomorrah, which could have been another settlement of Atlantis, such as at Tel El Haman. The reason we can't find remnants of Atlantis is because the Neo-Atlanteans, aka the dynastic Egyptians, took all the stones that were still in good condition and repurposed them in the building of the pyramids of Egypt. Atlantis may not have had pyramids originally, but maybe an obelisk tower, the true Tower of Babel. So the pyramids we see today could be the remaining remnants of Atlantis repurposed for the construction of the pyramids as a memorial to the successors of Atlantis. What could be original is the quarries, although most likely more stones had to be quarried out if too many of the stone walls and towers and temples of Atlantis were cracked. The cracked stones would be carved down to smaller blocks in other temples or wall constructions in different locations throughout Egypt. What survives is the architectural inheritance and the construction techniques, possibly at the level of early Rome. So what is the date of Atlantis in Egypt? Well, there's one recent discovery that could give us a clue.
Okay, Dick, what got you guys so excited about F3?
Yeah, what we were doing was we were cutting open these cores, these tubes of sediment, with a saw, and each one started to show the same kind of thing. You know, this layer of sand in between darker colored sediments that we thought represented wetlands. And then the really cool thing about that was that the sand layer contained shells, marine shells.
Now, wait a minute. You're not we're on land. You're not talking about like land snails. You're talking about like mollusks, right?
Yeah, marine shells and little pieces of clay and stuff like that that just didn't look like a normal deposit. And what was so interesting about it was that core after core, when we split them open, we all saw very similar kinds of layers like this, which was not what we expected.
Based on these data, there's no question that we identified an ancient tsunami event in the core record from Dor.
So the key variables are what the water depth is, how big a submarine slide has been generated when the earthquake strikes, how much of the continental slope failed, basically. That creates a displacement, which is what you see in that big wave. And then there's the issue of also how far from the coast, the submarine slide happens, because that determines how rapidly the wave will reach the land surface. And you can see in the model that the wave is overwashing the coastline and is presumably decimating any coastal communities that might have been there. I think another cool thing you can see in the simulation is the orange area. So that was the area that got inundated by the tsunami wave. And it's not really uniform along the coastline. So the area immediately opposite the slope failure really gets hit. And then a little bit farther north as well, up closer to the town of Haifa.
So we nailed the age of this tsunami deposit to 7,900 to 7,300 BC. And we did this using a relatively new innovative technique called optically stimulated luminescence dating. OSL dating dates the last time that sand grains were exposed to light. So we were able to subsample the cores in the dark and then bring them to my lab at Utah State University to determine how old they were.
So the date of 7,900 BC, that might be the date of the destruction of Atlantis in Egypt. But the tsunami deposit is still not known what caused this deposit, if it was an earthquake or an asteroid that triggered an earthquake in the Mediterranean Sea, the Atlantic of its time. But legends also indicate that it rained a lot, and this could be a hint to the African humid period, where abnormal monsoons may have emerged. So could an asteroid redirect a monsoon or typhoon to follow up the Red Sea, flooding the Nile in a flash flood while tsunami is coming from the opposite direction? This seems very unlikely, but I think many of us tend to focus on the natural disasters but fail to realize the supernatural forces, aka UAPs. If you haven't been paying attention to the news, I suggest you see my videos on UAPs. So these UAPs can influence nature. We have to see if that is a factor. So stay tuned for part 3, where I will address the supernatural factors that even Plato alludes to. This has been Enigma Seeker. Keep seeking those enigmas.